The words landed like ice water across my heart, sharp, shocking, impossible to ignore. It should have been the most beautiful moment of our lives. Our only daughter, Victoria, was walking down the aisle, radiant beneath the soft June sun, her delicate veil glistening as it caught the light. The garden behind our Charleston home, with its towering magnolia trees and rows of hydrangeas in full bloom, looked like a page torn from a dream. 300 guests sat beneath white canopies, their faces glowing with joy, their eyes fixed on the couple about to embark on forever. And yet, Douglas, my husband of 30 years, leaned in close, his breath warm against my cheek as he delivered his devastating news. His voice was calm, unnervingly casual, as though we were discussing dinner reservations rather than unraveling decades of marriage. After this, I'm moving out. I've already packed. We'll talk later. My name is Evelyn Sharp. I am 58 years old. For 3 decades, I have been Douglas Sharp's devoted wife, his partner, his confidant, the quiet architect behind his success. We built a life together in Charleston, South Carolina, a life filled with family, tradition, and the careful cultivation of reputation. Today, I was meant to bask in the fruits of that labor, watching Victoria marry the love of her life, surrounded by those who mattered most. Instead, I stood there frozen, my small bouquet of white roses trembling ever so slightly in my hands, though my face remained composed, my expression serene. "Of course, dear," I whispered back, my voice as smooth as polished marble, betraying none of the storm rising within me. Douglas straightened his tie, his expression untroubled, his focus drifting back to the ceremony as if he'd merely reminded me to pick up milk on the way home. And there she was, 3 rows behind us, Leah Morrison, his secretary. 28 years old, dressed in an elegant navy gown that suddenly struck me as far too extravagant for her salary. I'd met her a handful of times at Bright Hollow Development's company events. She'd always seemed professional, courteous, harmless even. How naive I had been. As Victoria and Thomas stood beneath the arch of magnolia branches, exchanging vows that spoke of commitment, loyalty, and unwavering devotion, I found myself grasping the cruel irony of the moment. Words that once held such promise now rang hollow, tainted by betrayal lurking just beyond the veil of perfection. The photographer's camera clicked relentlessly, capturing every tender glance, every proud smile. To the world, Douglas and I were the picture of success, a couple who had weathered 3 decades together, building a life that many envied. But beneath the polished exterior, cracks had been forming for months. I saw them long before today. 6 months ago, the subtle shifts began. Douglas, who had always been steady, predictable in his habits, suddenly transformed. Late nights at the office became routine, explained away with talk of urgent projects and impossible deadlines. His phone, once carelessly left on kitchen counters, became an extension of his hand, password protected, always tucked away when I entered the room. His wardrobe evolved to comfortable khakis replaced by tailored suits, crisp shirts that made him appear younger, more vibrant. At first, I dismissed it all as the symptoms of midlife unease. After all, I understood reinvention. I had done it myself when I set aside my aspirations to support his. We built Bright Hollow Development together. While Douglas received the accolades, the magazine profiles, the speaking invitations, I managed the machinery behind the scenes. I balanced the ledgers, crafted investment strategies, and ensured the financial health of both the company and our home. My dreams as a certified public accountant never fully bloomed, sacrificed for the greater good of our family. I believed that counted for something. But belief doesn't shield you from reality. With each passing week, the distance grew. Conversations once filled with shared plans and quiet jokes turned into strained exchanges about logistics and obligations. I began noticing whispers at company gatherings, the lingering glances between Douglas and Leah, the slight blush on her cheeks when their eyes met. And so I prepared. While Douglas thought he was orchestrating an exit on his terms, I quietly built my own. I consulted attorneys, secured my financial independence, and rediscovered the resilient, intelligent woman I had been before I became Mrs. Sharp. I told no one, not even Victoria. I would not taint her happiness with my sorrow. Today, as I watched my daughter pledge her heart to the man she loved, I felt both the sting of betrayal and the steady beat of quiet determination rising within me. Douglas believed he'd cornered me with his timing, announcing his departure when I was bound by decorum, by the expectations of a mother on her daughter's wedding day. But he underestimated me. I will not unravel in public. I will not let bitterness steal this day from Victoria. My heart may ache, my pride may sting, but I will stand tall, smile gracefully, and celebrate the love my daughter has found. Later, when the music fades, when the guests depart, when the last of the champagne glasses are cleared, I will begin the next chapter of my life. One not defined by shadows of disappointment, but by rediscovery, growth, and hard-earned peace. I may be 58, but I am not finished. As Victoria and Thomas sealed their vows with a kiss, the crowd erupted in applause. I clapped too, my gaze steady, my spirit anchored by the quiet truth blooming inside me. Some endings arrive dressed as new beginnings. And I, Evelyn Sharp, will rise. Evelyn. The sound of my name from his lips soft, uncertain, hung in the air like smoke after a fire. For the first time in decades, I saw hesitation ripple across Douglas Sharp's carefully constructed mask of control. I'd spent 30 years being the perfect wife, the kind who smoothed every wrinkle before it formed. I hosted elegant dinner parties for his potential investors, charmed our neighbors, managed our household staff with quiet efficiency, and organized family vacations down to the hour. The bills were paid, the insurance renewed, the social calendar coordinated with military precision, all so Douglas never had to concern himself with life's inconvenient details. I raised Victoria while he traveled, clapped for his achievements at company galas, and downplayed my own contributions to his empire. I did all of it without complaint, believing that loyalty and sacrifice would be returned in kind. But something shifted after Victoria announced her engagement last year. Douglas changed, slowly at first, like winter creeping over the south. He became distracted, distant. He stared at his phone during dinner, claiming to catch up on industry news, though I could clearly see the reflection of text messages glowing in his wine glass. He stopped mentioning Leah Morrison by name, the young assistant from Bright Hollow Development. Suddenly, she became my assistant, described with careful, clinical neutrality that only deepened my suspicions. 3 months ago, I decided to stop waiting for answers. It started with small steps, combing through our joint credit card statements, flagging unfamiliar restaurants, purchases from boutiques that sold clothing 2 sizes smaller than mine. I noticed a second cell phone bill, tucked away in an account I'd never seen before. When Douglas claimed he'd be attending a real estate conference in Atlanta, I called the organizers. The event had been canceled 2 months earlier. That's when I reached out to Catherine Webb, a private investigator recommended by my longtime attorney, Harrison Phillips. Catherine was discreet, relentless, and thorough. Within weeks, she handed me a file heavy with evidence, photographs, financial records, dates, and times that told a story I could no longer deny. Leah Morrison wasn't just his assistant. She was his confidant, his companion, and apparently, his future. The apartment lease Catherine uncovered spelled it out in black and white. Douglas had signed a year-long contract for a luxury downtown condo. Both his name and Leah's were listed as occupants. The security deposit? Paid directly from a business account Douglas opened behind my back, funded by money quietly siphoned from our joint investments over several months. It was all happening in plain sight, cloaked by my trust and his arrogance. And yet, as I stood under twinkling garden lights at Victoria and Thomas's wedding reception, watching my daughter float across the dance floor in a sea of ivory silk, I didn't crumble. Instead, I found clarity. Douglas had underestimated me. He believed I was the passive wife, the woman who existed in the background of his spotlight. The one who never questioned, never challenged, never imagined a life beyond the walls of our marriage. He was wrong. The final, devastating revelation arrived just 2 weeks before Victoria's wedding. I'd been reviewing our financial records, a quiet evening ritual I resumed after months of suspicion. That's when I noticed the irregularities. Significant sums moved from our joint accounts to an unfamiliar investment fund, buried beneath layers of corporate jargon. I called Patricia Coleman, our financial advisor, my hands steady even as my heart pounded. "I assumed you were aware of the new portfolio Douglas established," Patricia said, her voice laced with subtle concern. "He specifically requested that all documentation be sent to his office. All the careful secrecy. All the misdirection. It was so precise, so calculated. Douglas thought he'd locked me out entirely. But he forgot who I was." That evening, I walked into his study, where he sat flipping through contracts, completely unaware of the storm gathering around him. I placed the printouts, clear evidence of his betrayal, on his desk without a word. For a brief moment, the confident, untouchable mask slipped. His eyes widened, surprise flashing across his face like lightning before a storm. "Evelyn." His voice faltered, the first crack in decades of control. I straightened my shoulders, meeting his gaze, my voice as calm as the tide rolling into Charleston Harbor. "You thought I wouldn't notice," I said, each word steady, deliberate. "You thought I wouldn't act." He opened his mouth, but I didn't wait for the lies. I'd already packed my own future. The documents in my hand weren't just proof of deception, they were my map to freedom. The legal steps were already in motion. I had secured my finances, consulted my attorneys, ensured Victoria's day would remain untouched by the shadows of our marriage. Douglas believed this was the end of my story. But in truth, it was only the beginning. I walked out of his study that night, not as the wife he betrayed, but as the woman who finally remembered her worth. "Investments," Douglas repeated, but his voice lacked its usual sharp confidence, the certainty that had built Bright Hollow Development and, for years, held sway over boardrooms and dinner parties alike. "I'm diversifying our holdings to protect our retirement," he added, but the words felt rehearsed, hollow, stripped of authenticity. "Our retirement." I kept my tone level, professional, a woman discussing numbers, not the dismantling of a life. "These transfers," I said, tapping the documents, "they're going to accounts with only your name attached. And according to Patricia, you've instructed that I be excluded from all communications regarding these so-called investments." Douglas stood, moving to the window that overlooked our manicured garden. The same garden where Victoria's wedding photos would soon be taken. Hydrangeas blooming, magnolias stretching skyward, beauty masking decay. "You've always trusted me to handle the financial decisions," he said, his back still turned. "Why are you questioning me now?" "Because this isn't handling finances, Douglas. This is hiding assets." The words landed with precision. His shoulders tensed, the room thick with the quiet, inevitable arrival of truth. "I know about Leah." I let the name settle in the air like ash. "I know about the apartment. The secret phone. All of it." He turned slowly. For the first time in 30 years, the man before me was unrecognizable. Gone was the affectionate, ambitious husband I'd built a life beside. In his place stood someone colder, calculating, his eyes scanning me not with love, but with assessment, as though I were another variable in a business negotiation. "What do you want?" he asked, quietly measured. "I want honesty." The words came out harder than intended, forged from months of betrayal, from the quiet erosion of trust. "I want to know how long you've been planning to leave. And I want to know why you're stealing from our joint accounts to fund your new life." Douglas straightened his tie, adjusting his stance, slipping back into the polished persona he wore so well, the successful developer, the empire builder. "I'm not stealing anything," he retorted smoothly. Those funds represent my contribution to our marriage. I have every right to protect my interests. Your interests? The audacity nearly took my breath away. I've managed our finances for 3 decades, Douglas. I know exactly what each of us contributed, and it's not what you think. For the first time, I saw the flicker of uncertainty behind his mask. He had always assumed I handled the mundane, the bills, the taxes, the endless spreadsheets, without realizing the intricate web I'd woven to safeguard our future. Investments layered beneath trusts, legal protections designed to preserve not just wealth, but legacy. Douglas had been too busy chasing deals, too confident in his assumptions to notice. As I left his study that night, the reality settled in. Our marriage was over. But so was his illusion of control. The weeks leading up to Victoria's wedding became a delicate waltz of deception. Douglas maintained his facade, the doting father, the attentive husband, enthusiastically debating seating charts, floral arrangements, and wine pairings. Meanwhile, I played the overwhelmed mother of the bride, my supposed distraction providing perfect cover. Behind closed doors, I met with Harrison Phillips, our family attorney of 15 years, though never privately until now. His office overlooked Charleston Harbor, the horizon dotted with sailboats gliding across the blue-gray water. I watched them for a moment, steady, determined, cutting through waves like whispers of freedom. Harrison spread photographs, financial documents, and Catherine Webb's meticulous timeline across his mahogany desk. "Evelyn," he said, voice low but firm, "what Douglas has done constitutes marital misconduct under South Carolina law." The weight of his words settled over the room. The secret transfers, the hidden apartment lease, the systematic depletion of joint assets, all of this supports your position in divorce proceedings. For the first time in months, I exhaled fully. "Can I protect Victoria from this?" I asked softly, the mother's instinct overriding everything else. "The wedding, her future, I don't want this to touch her day." Harrison's gaze softened, tempered by years of guiding clients through battles they never imagined fighting. "You've already protected her, Evelyn. You've protected more than you realize." And I had. The financial web I constructed wasn't merely spreadsheets and account numbers, it was a fortress. I'd quietly shifted certain assets, created layers of legal protection, prepared contingencies long before Douglas ever whispered betrayal into my ear during our daughter's walk down the aisle. He thought I was blind. But I had seen everything. As Victoria and Thomas danced beneath the garden lights, their faces aglow with hope, I stood beside Douglas for the cameras, smiling for posterity, my heart breaking and rebuilding all at once. The world saw a perfect family, a perfect marriage, a perfect day. But beneath the facade, a storm had passed, and I remained standing. Douglas underestimated me. And soon he would learn. The quiet wife, the overlooked partner, the woman in the background, she was never powerless. She was patient. And patience, when properly fueled by betrayal, is unstoppable. I wasn't interested in a lengthy, bitter court battle, the kind that stains reputations and leaves families in tatters, paraded across gossip columns like cautionary tales. Douglas thrived on his reputation. To the world, he was the picture of success, a devoted husband, a pillar of Charleston's community, the real estate mogul with deep Southern roots and deeper pockets. His entire empire depended on trust, relationships cultivated over decades, sealed with handshakes and champagne toasts, polished with charm and the illusion of stability. "I don't want to destroy him publicly," I told Harrison, my voice calm, resolute. "I want him to destroy himself." That's when we devised what Harrison privately called the surgical approach. Rather than confront Douglas directly or scramble to block his asset transfers, we'd allow him to continue. We'd watch, document, and ensure that every penny he funneled away was, in fact, money he no longer legally owned. The key was quiet, calculated restructuring. Over the next 10 days, I signed documents that moved the majority of our assets into irrevocable trusts, protected investment accounts, and legal entities beyond Douglas's reach, all done swiftly, discreetly. Beneath the cover of Wedding Preparations. Our family home, the Kiowa Island Vacation House. The income-generating properties tucked neatly into our portfolio. All of it repositioned to protect my interests, leaving Douglas's secret transfers exposed as evidence of attempted fraud. The most exquisite revelation came when Catherine, ever thorough, uncovered the full scope of Douglas's financial scheming. For months, he'd been methodically siphoning funds, believing he was securing a comfortable future with Leah, their hidden sanctuary, their financial cushion. What he didn't realize was that the very accounts he believed he controlled were intricately connected to assets I'd already shielded through legal restructuring. Your husband has essentially been stealing his own money and giving it to his mistress, Catherine explained with quiet satisfaction, sliding a report across the table. When the divorce proceedings begin, those transfers will be considered dissipation of marital assets. He'll be required to reimburse the estate in full. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. Douglas's confidence during those final weeks before the wedding was almost entertaining to watch. He'd stroll in from his clandestine meetings with Leah, wearing the smug expression of a man who believed he was 3 steps ahead. His entire plan, crafted so meticulously, depended on timing, announcing his departure at the wedding, catching me off guard, minimizing my ability to react. He truly believed I was still that woman, the quiet wife lost in floral arrangements and seating charts, blissfully unaware. At Victoria's rehearsal dinner, I watched him work the room, his speech so polished, so rehearsed, it could have passed for poetry. He spoke of love, commitment, and the foundation we'd built, a marriage forged from partnership and trust. His words floated across the candlelit room like confetti, met with applause and warm smiles from friends and family who had no idea they were witnessing the unraveling of the man behind the facade. Later, I noticed him checking his phone, over and over, fingers dancing across the screen, likely finalizing details with Leah about their next chapter. The layers of irony were so rich, it was almost poetic. Douglas, standing in front of our closest friends, celebrating not only Victoria's future, but unknowingly his own downfall. 2 days before the wedding, I made my final preparations. In a downtown safety deposit box, I placed copies of everything. Financial documents, legal agreements, the private investigator's photographs, a meticulously documented timeline of Douglas's betrayal and asset transfers. On top of the stack, I added the divorce papers Harrison had drafted, a clean, efficient dismantling of the life Douglas thought he controlled. I also included a comprehensive asset breakdown that, when Douglas finally laid eyes on it, would reveal just how thoroughly he had miscalculated me. On the morning of Victoria's wedding, I awoke before the sun, the house still and quiet. I brewed coffee, the familiar aroma grounding me as I reviewed every document one last time, ensuring every signature, every decimal point, was flawless. In a few short hours, Douglas would lean in during the ceremony, the perfect moment he'd choreographed, believing he held all the cards, that he'd orchestrated my downfall alongside his new beginning. He had no idea. I'd been preparing for this moment for months. Every smile I'd offered, every agreement to trust him, every polite nod at his rehearsed speeches, it was all part of my quiet strategy. I wasn't blindsided. I wasn't defeated. I was ready. And soon, Douglas Sharp would finally understand the quiet strength of the woman he thought he could outmaneuver. The sweetest part? He never saw it coming. Victoria's voice trembled with emotion as she promised to love Thomas through every challenge life might bring them, her words heavy with sincerity, their meaning almost prophetic given the storm brewing quietly in the front row. I held my composure throughout the ceremony. I smiled when expected, dabbed my eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief when Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. I played my part, the proud mother, the pillar of our family. After the vows, the photography session felt surreal, a carefully staged performance of unity. Douglas and I stood side by side for portraits, his arm comfortably draped around my waist, his hand resting just above the curve of my hip as if nothing between us had changed. His smile was wide, his eyes bright, the devoted husband captured perfectly for the family album. When the photographer requested a picture of just the parents, Douglas pulled me closer, beaming for the camera, his grip a fraction tighter than necessary, as if clinging to the last remnants of his illusion. The flashes clicked, freezing the falsehood in perfect light. "Beautiful ceremony," Leah commented smoothly when she approached us during cocktail hour, her tone polished, her expression carefully neutral. "Victoria looks absolutely stunning." "Thank you," I replied pleasantly, the warmth in my voice masking the steel underneath. I noted the slight tightening of Douglas's jaw as she spoke, the way his posture stiffened, as though my civility unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. "We're so proud of her," I added, the words floating easily, layered with unspoken meaning. The three of us stood there for a moment, an awkward triangle of forced politeness, balancing on the sharp edge of truth none of us dared name aloud. Leah excused herself quickly, her instinct sharp enough to sense the tension she couldn't yet fully understand. Dinner followed, a symphony of speeches, laughter, champagne toasts. And yet, Douglas's performance remained the most compelling of all. He stood to deliver the traditional father of the bride speech, his voice strong, layered with just the right amount of sentiment. He spoke of watching Victoria grow up, of the pride he felt as he watched her step into this new chapter of life. His words wrapped the room in nostalgia and admiration. And then, the carefully rehearsed finale. "None of this would have been possible without Evelyn," he said, turning toward me, the spotlight warming my face. "She's been the heart of our family, the woman who made all of this possible." The applause was thunderous. Guests approached me afterward, their faces glowing with admiration, their words ringing with compliments. "What a wonderful marriage you have. You and Douglas are such an inspiration." Victoria's so lucky to have parents who adore each other after all these years. Each well-meaning sentiment felt like a small blade, but I smiled graciously, thanking them, even as I plotted Douglas's downfall beneath my poised exterior. As the evening unfolded, I watched him, ever the actor, checking his watch repeatedly. His eyes drifted across the room, finding Leah, his anticipation building with every passing moment. He believed tonight marked the beginning of their life together. What he didn't realize was that tonight marked the beginning of his undoing. The moment I had been patiently waiting for came during the last dance. Victoria and Thomas swayed gently to their wedding song, wrapped in love, oblivious to the quiet reckoning happening mere feet away. Douglas leaned in close again, his voice soft, edged with false compassion. "I know this is difficult," he murmured, "but I think it's better this way. A clean break, no prolonged arguments, no messy negotiations." I smiled, my expression serene, my voice steady as glass. "I agree completely," I replied smoothly. "A clean break is exactly what we need." Douglas's eyes flickered with surprise, his confident facade faltering ever so slightly. Perhaps he'd expected tears, a plea for reconciliation, the wounded wife clinging to the remnants of what was. Instead, he found resolve. "I'm glad you understand," he said, his tone softening, already imagining his seamless transition into a new life. "I was worried you might make this complicated." I turned to him, locking eyes, my smile unwavering. "Oh, Douglas," I whispered sweetly, the weight of months of planning tucked neatly behind my words. "I would never make things complicated for you." There was something in my tone, a quiet certainty, that made him pause. His eyes searched mine, the confident gleam dimming for a heartbeat. But before he could question it, Victoria and Thomas approached, glowing with happiness, ready to begin their honeymoon departure tradition. The guests gathered for farewell photographs, tossing rice and flower petals into the evening air. Douglas stood beside me, his arm looped casually around my shoulders, rice sprinkled in his hair, playing the devoted husband for the final time. And I, standing composed, smiling softly for the cameras, felt an unfamiliar but welcome sensation blooming quietly in my chest. Completion. The chapters of my old life were closing, neatly, deliberately. Douglas didn't know it yet, but his carefully constructed world was already crumbling, piece by piece. And I was just getting started. Victoria was safely married now, on her way to Italy with Thomas, beginning her honeymoon and her new life. The guests were filing out, offering warm embraces, heartfelt compliments, and glowing praise for the beautiful celebration. And Douglas, so certain he'd orchestrated the perfect escape, was minutes away from realizing his carefully crafted plan was nothing more than an elaborate trap he had walked himself into. After the last champagne glass was cleared and the catering staff had packed up, the garden grew quiet. The fairy lights still twinkled above, casting a soft glow over the magnolia trees as the evening settled. Douglas loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and for the first time that day, looked utterly at ease, pleased with how seamlessly the entire event had gone. That went well, he remarked, surveying the remnants of Victoria's reception, the petals scattered across the lawn, the chairs slightly askew, the faint echo of music lingering in the air. She looked happy. She did, I agreed softly, savoring the sweetness of that truth. Then, turning to face him fully, I let my voice shift, gentle but firm. I believe you mentioned we needed to talk. Douglas's expression tightened, the practiced calm of a man preparing for what he believed would be a difficult, but controllable, conversation. Evelyn, he began, his tone rehearsed. I know this comes as a shock, but I think if we handle this maturely, we can minimize the disruption for everyone involved. His words floated between us, heavy with condescension. I appreciate your concern for minimizing disruption, I replied, reaching into the small evening purse I'd carried throughout the entire wedding, resting at my side like a quiet secret. I pulled out the manila envelope, thick, crisp, carefully prepared. I've put together something that should help with that. Douglas's brow furrowed as he accepted the envelope, still confident enough to believe he held control. What's this? Everything you'll need for your fresh start, I answered sweetly, watching the first flicker of unease cross his features. Including some documents I think you should review immediately. The garden around us stood still, the hush of leaves, the distant hum of crickets, the only witnesses to what unfolded next. Douglas opened the envelope, flipping through the contents. I watched his face carefully, noting every micro-expression, the small frown that creased his forehead, the tightening of his jaw, the widening of his eyes as the pages revealed the full extent of what I'd prepared. The moment his confidence began to crack was subtle, but unmistakable. His fingers slowed over the divorce papers, his eyes darting across the dates, confusion turning to alarm. This is dated 3 weeks ago, he said finally, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty I'd heard from him all day. Yes, I confirmed, my tone light, conversational. As if we were simply discussing garden renovations instead of the dismantling of his life. I filed them the day after I discovered your secret apartment lease. Douglas's hands trembled slightly as he reached the financial documents, the carefully compiled evidence of every hidden account, every unauthorized transfer, every penny moved to fund his future with Leah. But more importantly, the legal structures I'd built, silently, efficiently, months before his scheme ever began. His skin paled as he flipped through page after page. You can't do this, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. These accounts, these investments. I established them. The money came from our joint holdings. Actually, Douglas, I interrupted softly, tilting my head with quiet amusement. If you look more carefully at the dates, you'll see that I restructured our holdings well before you began your little, unauthorized transfers. I kept my tone deliberately calm, pleasant. Because there was no greater weapon against arrogance than grace. What you've been moving for the past 6 months, I continued, is money you no longer had legal access to. His eyes darted back to the documents, his fingers trembling now. The realization settled over him like a cold shadow. The house, the business accounts, the investment properties, all shielded, protected, locked behind irrevocable trusts and legal entities that required my explicit consent for any transactions. Douglas's face drained of color as the implications closed in around him. I watched him flip frantically through the paperwork, searching for loopholes that didn't exist, trying to claw back control that had long since slipped through his fingers. I thought you were just handling bills, balancing checkbooks, he muttered, his voice cracking with disbelief. You always underestimated me, Douglas, I replied softly, my heart steady, my pulse calm. And that was your biggest mistake. The garden. The same one where we'd hosted countless parties, celebrated anniversaries, watched our daughter's wedding, stood in quiet contrast to the unraveling happening between us. For the first time in 30 years, Douglas Sharp stood exposed, not as the charming patriarch, but as a man undone by his own arrogance. And I stood free, with nothing left to prove and everything ahead to reclaim. Douglas rifled through the papers, his fingers shaking, his eyes scanning every line as if searching for some hidden loophole or legal oversight he could exploit, something, anything, to regain the upper hand. But there was nothing. Your transfers to Leah's accounts constitute fraud under South Carolina law, I reminded him gently, watching the color drain from his face. Harrison has already filed the appropriate paperwork with the district attorney's office. Douglas looked up at me then, and for the first time in 30 years, I saw it. Genuine fear. A raw, dawning comprehension of how completely he'd been outmaneuvered by the woman he'd thought would stand silently by, blind to his betrayals. How long have you known? He asked, his voice hoarse, brittle beneath the weight of his unraveling. Long enough to protect myself properly, I replied, the calm in my voice only deepening his panic. Long enough to ensure that your betrayal couldn't destroy what I've spent 30 years building. We stood in silence then, surrounded by scattered rose petals and the faint remnants of champagne bubbles, the ruins of Victoria's perfect wedding now the backdrop for the quiet, inevitable collapse of our marriage. Douglas's panic was immediate and complete. His once confident posture wilted as he stood amidst the remnants of the evening, clutching the divorce papers, his entire world cracking beneath him. The man who'd whispered his escape plan to me so smugly during our daughter's ceremony was gone. In his place stood someone desperate, cornered. Evelyn, please, he begged, his voice cracking, eyes darting across my face for mercy that wouldn't come. We can work this out. I'll call off the apartment, I'll end things with Leah. We don't have to destroy everything we've built. I looked at him then, really looked at him. Not the polished, public-facing Douglas Sharp, but the small, flawed man behind the mask. And, for the first time in years, I felt something close to pity. Even now, with his empire slipping through his fingers, he didn't understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. He thought this was about jealousy. About hurt feelings. Something to be smoothed over with shallow apologies and empty promises. Douglas, I said softly, my voice heavy with finality, you chose to end our marriage the moment you whispered your announcement during our daughter's wedding ceremony. I took a quiet step closer, my words cutting through the still evening air. You chose to steal from our accounts to fund your affair. You chose to hide assets, to plan your future with no consideration for the woman who spent 30 years building that future beside you. His hands trembled as he flipped through the documents again, his eyes scanning for an escape that didn't exist. The business, our reputation. Evelyn, if this becomes public, it'll destroy everything. It doesn't have to become public, I replied, my tone level, offering him a lifeline wrapped in conditions. If you sign the divorce agreement and cooperate fully with the asset recovery process, we can handle this quietly. I let the promise linger before delivering the truth he couldn't ignore. But if you choose to fight? If you drag this out? I leaned in slightly, eyes steady on his. Every detail of your affair, every hidden account, every misuse of company funds will become part of the public record. The garden lights flickered softly above us, casting golden halos over the quiet devastation settling on his face. Douglas went pale, his expression hollow as the full scope of his predicament crystallized. His carefully timed betrayal, his months of scheming, his new life, all unraveling by my hand. He had believed I was too passive, too trusting, too small. What he hadn't seen, what he never bothered to look for, was the quiet strength in the woman beside him, the one he'd taken for granted, who had spent 3 decades growing roots so deep even his betrayal couldn't shake them. How did you know? He asked, desperate now, his voice stripped of arrogance, reduced to the raw, small question of a man who had underestimated the wrong person. I've always known who you really are, Douglas, I replied, my voice sweet but firm, layered with years of clarity. The question now is whether you're going to accept responsibility for your choices or make this uglier than it needs to be. And with that, the inevitable began to unfold, exactly as Harrison had predicted. By Monday morning, Douglas discovered his access to every significant account terminated. His business credit cards, the ones he'd so carelessly used for his secret rendezvous and hidden transactions, were canceled. His personal accounts frozen. The investment portfolios he'd once boasted about, legally protected, well beyond his reach. The apartment, the cornerstone of his new beginning with Leah, secured by funds he no longer owned, contracts he could no longer control. I moved swiftly, cleanly, quietly, just as I always had, while Douglas watched the life he'd built on deception crumble, one silent document at a time. And I finally stood in the truth of my own strength, ready for the next chapter, the one I would write entirely on my terms. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the foundation for our greatest becoming. It's been 6 months since that night, the night Douglas's elaborate escape plan unraveled in his hands, the night he discovered the woman he thought would crumble quietly had been building an unshakable fortress beneath his feet. The garden looks different now. The same magnolia trees sway gently in the summer breeze, their blooms full and fragrant, but to me, they symbolize more than just beauty. They symbolize survival, growth, reinvention. The place where Victoria twirled in ivory silk on her wedding day has become my sanctuary, the backdrop not of endings, but of beginnings. Douglas? His world, built on half-truths and hidden bank statements, collapsed faster than either of us expected. The fraud investigation proceeded quietly but ruthlessly. His unauthorized transfers, the shell accounts, the fraudulent funding for that apartment with Leah. They painted a picture of deception so clear even his most loyal allies couldn't defend him. Leah Morrison? She vanished from Charleston society within weeks, her resignation from Bright Hollow development circulating alongside whispered rumors, cold stares, and closed doors. Catherine's investigation left no thread unpulled. Her photographs, timelines, and financial reports ensured Leah's name was synonymous with scandal. I almost pitied her. Almost. Douglas, meanwhile, attempted his damage control, calls to mutual friends, carefully worded explanations, desperate meetings over coffee where he tried to paint himself as the misunderstood victim of a complicated situation. But Charleston? Charleston remembers. Word travels fast in a town built on history and reputation, and Douglas's once sterling image, tarnished like silver left too long in the rain. The man who'd prided himself on trust, on honor, on appearances, stood exposed. By the time Victoria and Thomas returned from Italy, sun-kissed and glowing, the dust had quietly settled. Douglas signed the divorce agreement, every signature laced with silent defeat. He never dared face Victoria with the truth. I made sure of that. For her, for our daughter, this was a time of joy, not betrayal. And me? I discovered I'm far more than the quiet woman standing beside a powerful man. I've reclaimed my name, my voice, my future. The assets I protected now fund my own ventures. I've returned to the career I set aside all those years ago, partnering with Harrison and other women like me, smart, underestimated, quietly powerful, helping them build financial fortresses of their own. People whisper still, of course, about the scandal, the downfall of Douglas Sharp, the quiet grace with which I stood through it all. But let them whisper, because behind every whispered rumor is a lesson. Never underestimate the woman who holds the ledger, who reads the fine print, who smiles politely while building her own empire behind the scenes. Sometimes, strength looks like restraint. Other times, it looks like walking away with your head held high and your future secured. I lean back in my garden chair now, the magnolias blooming, their petals drifting softly to the ground like confetti from a celebration that never quite ended. Victoria visits often. She brings laughter, stories from her new life, dreams of the family she and Thomas will build. There's hope again. And me? I've found peace. I've found fire. And I've learned that the life I thought Douglas destroyed was never mine to lose. It was mine to reclaim. The next chapter? It's unwritten. But it's mine, and I intend to make every word of it unforgettable.